Back in the fall of 1857, a letter showed up at the Charleston Mercury newspaper. It was written in really neat handwriting, the kind you get when someone has been practicing writing in secret for years. The person who sent it called herself M. Washington, and she said she knew about some really scary things that had happened on a big farm called a plantation, way out in Beaufort County, South Carolina. The newspaper editor, a guy named William Morrison, thought it was probably just made-up abolitionist drama at first, but then he noticed some super specific details like real places, real family names, and real dates that made him think, wait, maybe this is actually true. So he decided to look into it. The plantation she was talking about was called Greystone Manor. It was huge, about 2,000 acres of rice fields sitting along the Coombe River, around 30 miles southwest of Charleston. According to old property records from the Beaufort County Courthouse, the place had belonged to a family called the Harringtons since 1792, when a man named Cornelius Harrington bought the land with money he made from his shipping business. By the 1850s, the place was being run by Cornelius's grandson, Edmund Harrington, a guy who newspapers described as a quiet, keep-to-himself type who was very careful and precise about how he ran things. Now, what made M. Washington's letter really unsettling was her claim that she had been born right there on that plantation in 1835 and had stayed there until she escaped in 1856. She said that during her last year at Greystone, she saw things that made no sense and that she just could not get out of her head even after she got away. In her letter, she pointed out very specific spots on the property, like a root cellar hidden under the main house, some buildings that were built weirdly far away from where everyone else worked, and what she called the silent house, which sat right at the edge of a spooky cypress swamp. Morrison's investigation kicked off with a look at county records. The 1850 census showed that Edmund Harrington owned 63 enslaved people, which was actually a pretty small number for a plantation as big as Greystone. And here's where it gets strange. A lot of those enslaved people were listed as being over 50 years old, and there were barely any kids under 15. That was really different from other nearby plantations, where you'd usually see a lot of younger people and children because that's just how those populations naturally grew. Church records from St. Helena's Parish made things even weirder. Most plantation owners kept detailed records of births, deaths, and baptisms, partly for religious reasons, partly just to keep track. But Harrington's records had huge gaps. Between 1850 and 1856, only 3 births were recorded for Greystone Manor, even though there were 63 people living there, and only 2 deaths. That basically made no sense. Either the people there were in remarkably good health, or nobody was actually bothering to write things down, or maybe there was something much worse going on. When Morrison tried asking local people about the Harrington plantation, he got basically nothing. The Harrington family barely showed up to church. Edmund rarely went to any social events in Charleston, even though his family had been important there for a long time. Merchants who did business with the plantation said their interactions were always short and strictly business. Rice shipments from Greystone came in on time, but the amounts didn't quite match up with how big the plantation was supposed to be. The physical description of Greystone Manor that M. Washington gave in her letter matched old survey maps from 1843 perfectly. The main house was built in the fancy style that successful plantation owners liked, and it sat on a little hill looking over the river. A long path lined with big live oak trees stretched from the main road to the front of the house. But here's what was different: the buildings where enslaved people lived weren't set up the way they usually were. Instead of one group near the main house, they were split into 3 separate spots, and one of those spots was almost a full mile away from everything else, right near the edge of the swamp. M. Washington's letter got really detailed when she talked about her last months at Greystone, and all those details checked out. She clearly knew this place really well. She mentioned the rice mill wheel that only turned during certain times depending on the tides. She talked about the pattern of the work bells: 5 rings at dawn, 3 at noon, 4 in the evening. That's not a schedule anybody would just make up because it didn't match any normal plantation schedule in any farming guide from back then. And most importantly, she described the basement of the main house. You could only get to it through a hidden door behind a fake wall in the kitchen pantry. That's not the kind of thing a stranger would know. The events M. Washington described started, she said, in late 1855. She talked about a group of new people who showed up and were put in those faraway buildings near the swamp. And get this, these new people were never seen doing any work in the rice fields. They didn't join in any of the normal stuff that everyone else did day to day. Edmund Harrington himself kept going over to check on them, which was super unusual, because normally a plantation owner would leave that kind of thing to the overseers or trusted workers. What bothered M. Washington more than anything was the quiet coming from that part of the plantation. She said usually you'd hear conversations floating through the air in the evenings, kids playing, songs while people worked, but the area near the swamp was always completely silent, even when you'd expect to hear something. And when she tried to walk over there while doing her regular duties, other enslaved people would block her path and steer her away without ever explaining why. The silent house M. Washington mentioned in her letter seemed to be a separate building, not the main house, not the regular quarters. She described it as sitting right at the point where two paths crossed, one heading toward the swamp and one toward an old abandoned part of the rice fields. She said the building was clearly being taken care of, someone was cleaning it and fixing it up, but it was totally cut off from everything. The windows had thick cloth covering them. The one door was always locked. And she never once saw anyone going in or out during the daytime. During the winter of 1855 to 1856, M. Washington noticed things were changing. Edmund Harrington started going to Charleston way more often, sometimes staying for several days at a time. While he was away, a man named Thomas Mills, an overseer who'd been at Greystone for over 10 years, was in charge. M. Washington said Mills seemed really uncomfortable being the one responsible, and he cracked down hard on where people could go and what they could do, even more than usual. The most important thing M. Washington described in her letter happened on a night in February 1856. She said she was woken up by sounds coming from underneath the main house, voices whispering really urgently. Her sleeping quarters were close enough to the main house that sounds from the basement could travel on a quiet night. She said she snuck out and crept toward the main house, being really careful not to get caught. The sounds were coming from that hidden basement room she already knew about. There was a tiny window at ground level, mostly hidden by bushes growing against the foundation, and through it she could see lamplight and people moving around. The voices were muffled by the stone walls and wooden floors, but it sounded like multiple people were talking, like someone was teaching or reciting something. What she said she saw through that little window became the most disturbing part of her whole story. M. Washington said she counted about 8 to 10 people sitting in a circle inside the basement room. Edmund Harrington was there, and so were several people she had never seen before, men and women dressed nicely, clearly not from the plantation. In the center of the circle, she could see what looked like papers or books, though she was too far away to make out what was actually on them. According to M. Washington's account, this gathering went on for several hours. People took turns speaking, though she couldn't make out the actual words. At different points, people would stand up and move around the room like they were following some kind of set plan or ritual. The whole thing wrapped up right around dawn, with everyone putting out the lamps. M. Washington said she never saw anyone leave through the outside doors of the main house, so she figured there must be another way in and out through the basement itself. After that night, M. Washington started noticing more changes. The people living in the faraway quarters near the swamp began to disappear, but not all at once. Little by little, week by week, she could tell because she helped prepare meals and the portions kept needing to be smaller. When she asked other enslaved people what was happening to these individuals, they either said nothing or quickly changed the subject. The last thing M. Washington described in her letter happened in early spring of 1856. She found a section of the rice fields that had been left alone, and the ground there looked like it had recently been dug up and then filled back in a square patch about 20 feet across with no crops planted. The dirt looked different from the dirt around it, a different texture and color, which showed that soil had been dug out and then put back. And nearby she found some really disturbing things: scraps of cloth, a metal button, and what she described as hair that looked like it had been cut, not torn or ripped. All of that together is what pushed M. Washington to make her escape from Greystone Manor. She described in her letter how she planned it very carefully, using her knowledge of the local waterways and connections she had with enslaved people on nearby plantations. She said her escape route went through the cypress swamp, eventually reaching the Combahee River, where she got onto a boat heading to Charleston. M. Washington ended her letter by saying that what happened at Greystone Manor was way more disturbing than the normal cruelties of plantation life. She said Edmund Harrington and his associates were doing things that went beyond just economic abuse, what she called experiments upon human souls. From everything she described, it sounded like the things being done there combined medical experimentation with some kind of psychological manipulation, and the people chosen to go through it were picked specifically because they were cut off from the rest of the plantation community. When Morrison tried to actually investigate, he ran into walls everywhere. Edmund Harrington refused to reply to the newspaper's letters and wouldn't agree to a meeting. When people tried to visit Greystone Manor in person, they were turned away. Plantation workers said Harrington was traveling and had left orders not to let anyone in. Lawyers couldn't do much either because the law in South Carolina gave plantation owners a huge amount of control over who could come onto their property. Morrison also tried hard to find M. Washington herself. The letter had been delivered to the newspaper by someone else, and there was no return address. Morrison asked around in Charleston's free black community and among recently arrived formerly enslaved people, but nobody had any information about where she was. It seemed like she had either kept moving further north or was staying very carefully hidden somewhere in the city. Trying to verify the population numbers at the plantation from the outside wasn't easy either. The 1860 census, taken a few years after M. Washington's escape, showed Edmund Harrington now listing 59 enslaved people. That was fewer than before, but it could have been explained by a lot of things: deaths, sales, or people running away. Still, the age breakdown was still weirdly skewed toward older people with very few children, just like before. Local medical records didn't show anything unusual. A doctor named Samuel Hughes, who worked with several plantations in the area, said there were no outbreaks of disease or strange health problems in Buffett County during that time. But his records did note something odd. Edmund Harrington had never once called him to come treat sick enslaved people. Harrington said he handled medical stuff himself, which was technically legal but was considered pretty unusual for a plantation owner of his status. Then the investigation took a turn in the summer of 1857. Morrison got a second letter, this time from a different person. The writer said his name was James Crawford, and he claimed he had worked as an overseer at Greystone Manor in 1854 and 1855. Crawford's letter backed up several things M. Washington had said, especially the weird setup of the plantation and the fact that there were people being kept separately in those distant quarters. Crawford added his own details about how Edmund Harrington ran things. He said Harrington was intensely secretive about certain parts of the property and kept personal control over areas that would normally be handled by an overseer. The remote quarters near the swamp, Crawford said, were strictly off-limits to him. Harrington claimed the people there needed special care because of some unspecified health issues. Crawford also said his time at Greystone Manor ended abruptly in late 1855 after he started asking questions about some unusual supply orders. He had noticed purchases that didn't make sense for normal plantation operations, medical instruments, chemicals used in preservation, and way more lime than you'd ever need for farming. When Crawford brought it up, Harrington fired him on the spot and personally walked him off the property. Crawford's letter also mentioned the basement room under the main house, which he called Edmund Harrington's private study and laboratory. Crawford said he'd seen scientific equipment and medical books during the few times he'd been inside the main house. He described Harrington as unusually well-educated for a plantation owner, with a special fascination with anatomy and what Crawford called the workings of the human mind. With two accounts now pointing in the same direction, Morrison dug deeper into Edmund Harrington's background, and what he found was really surprising. Unlike most plantation owners' sons, who usually went to schools focused on classical education and farming, Harrington had spent years in Philadelphia studying at medical schools and working with doctors who specialized in mental illness. Records from Philadelphia's medical community showed that Edmund Harrington had attended lectures at Jefferson Medical College in 1848 and 1849. He studied anatomy, physiology, and something called alienism, which was the old-timey word for treating mental disorders. Several professors remembered him as a smart but obsessive student who was especially interested in experimental ways of understanding human behavior and the mind. One of his professors, Dr. Richard Whitman, wrote a letter to Morrison describing Harrington as brilliant but disturbing in how he wanted to apply medical knowledge. Whitman said Harrington had proposed experiments that the medical faculty thought were completely unethical, things involving human subjects that no one would have allowed. When those proposals were shut down, Harrington packed up and left Philadelphia abruptly, without ever finishing his medical degree. This background information started to explain the things described in M. Washington's and James Crawford's letters. Harrington had real medical training, he had an isolated plantation, and he had legal authority over enslaved people who had absolutely no legal protection against anything done to them. All of those things together created exactly the kind of situation where the abuse both letter writers described could have happened. Morrison's investigation also uncovered financial weirdness in Harrington's records. Bank records showed big random payments that couldn't be explained by normal plantation costs. Purchases from Philadelphia suppliers included medical equipment, chemical compounds, and books on anatomy and mental medicine. And these purchases kept coming regularly throughout the 1850s, which suggested this wasn't just a hobby, it was something ongoing. Then Morrison found probably the most chilling piece of the puzzle, buried in court records in Charleston. In 1854, Edmund Harrington had gone to court and asked permission to set up what he called a private medical facility on his plantation for treating mental illness among his enslaved people. He framed it as a humanitarian thing, claiming these individuals weren't able to do normal plantation work because of their conditions. The court said yes, and they gave him permission with barely any oversight requirements at all. The court basically assumed, as courts back then usually did, that plantation owners knew best how to manage their own people and property. And this legal approval gave Harrington a lot of cover for doing things that might otherwise have attracted attention. The timing of this court petition lined up almost exactly with what M. Washington described, the arrival of those new individuals who were kept separately, starting around 1855. The court records suggested those people may have been specifically chosen for Harrington's experimental medical program. More digging turned up something else. Edmund Harrington had connections with other people who were into the same disturbing stuff. Records from a Philadelphia medical supply company showed that Harrington had been regularly in contact with a guy named Dr. Marcus Webb. Webb had been kicked out of Jefferson Medical College for performing unauthorized surgeries on poor patients at Philadelphia General Hospital without their knowledge or consent, purely to test his theories. Letters between Harrington and Webb, found through the supply company's records, talked about what they called opportunities to advance medical knowledge by systematically observing human subjects under controlled conditions. They specifically mentioned Greystone Manor as the perfect location for this kind of work, because of its isolation and because Harrington had full legal control over his enslaved people. These letters also mentioned that Webb actually visited Greystone Manor in 1855 and 1856, right when M. Washington said strangers were showing up to those gatherings in the basement of the main house. Webb being there would explain why there were people with medical training involved in whatever was happening. The investigation hit a pivotal moment in autumn 1857, when Morrison got word about what was happening with Greystone Manor at that very moment. A contact at the Beaufort County Courthouse told him that Edmund Harrington had filed paperwork to sell the plantation and move to Louisiana. The whole sale was moving unusually fast, and Harrington had already left South Carolina, leaving a Charleston law firm to handle everything. Morrison's attempt to actually visit the abandoned plantation finally worked in October 1857. He brought along a photographer and a doctor, and the law firm handling the sale let them in. What they found there was physical proof of everything described in the letters from M. Washington and James Crawford. The basement room under the main house was exactly where and how they said it would be, a big windowless room that you got to through a hidden door behind the kitchen pantry. Inside were leftover scientific tools, including surgical instruments, chemical equipment, and what looked like devices designed to restrain human beings. The tables along the walls clearly showed signs of regular use, and the accompanying doctor said the stains on them were likely biological. Books and papers left behind in the basement showed just how deep Harrington's obsessions went. Medical textbooks on anatomy, surgery, and mental medicine were mixed together with handwritten journals full of what appeared to be detailed records of experiments. The journals described human subjects using only numbers, not names, documenting how they responded to different treatments and procedures. One entry from February 1856 described an experiment on subject number 17, tracking the person's responses to something Harrington called progressive psychological pressure. The entry noted how the subject first resisted, then gradually gave in, and concluded with observations about whether the behavioral changes Harrington had forced through the experiments would stick permanently. Another journal had anatomical drawings that looked like they were based on real human dissection, way too precise and detailed to have been copied from a book. The notes alongside them discussed the connection between physical brain structure and mental functioning, with a particular focus on the parts of the brain that controlled memory and emotional responses. The faraway quarters near the cypress swamp also had evidence of what had been going on. The buildings were empty now, but they had been modified in ways that were very different from normal enslaved housing. Windows had been boarded up with heavy wood. Interior walls had soundproofing material. Several rooms had metal rings bolted to the walls and floors, clearly built to hold people in specific positions. And then they found what was in the ground in the area M. Washington had described. When they carefully dug up the disturbed soil, they found a series of shallow graves with human remains inside. The bodies showed evidence of medical procedures, surgical cuts, missing organs, bones that had been altered, all pointing to systematic experimentation. And the number of graves was roughly the same as the number of people M. Washington had said disappeared from those remote quarters. A doctor named Charles Hammond from Charleston examined the remains and found evidence of procedures that went way beyond any legitimate medical treatment. Several skulls had holes drilled in them with surgical precision, suggesting brain surgery. Bones had cut marks from dissection. The way the remains were arranged suggested bodies had been systematically taken apart for anatomical study. Dr. Hammond's report concluded that the people buried in those graves had been put through medical experimentation of the most brutal and organized kind. The skill and precision of the procedures confirmed that the people doing this had real medical training, which matched what was known about Harrington's background and his connection to Dr. Marcus Webb. Morrison published the findings in the Charleston Mercury in November 1857, and it caused a massive reaction throughout South Carolina and beyond. The carefully documented evidence of systematic medical experimentation on enslaved people made this one of the most thoroughly proven cases of this kind of abuse in the pre-Civil War South. Northern newspapers picked up the story and ran with it, and abolitionists used it as powerful evidence of how corrupt and evil the whole system of slavery really was. But the legal response, pretty much nothing. South Carolina law was extremely limited in what it could do, and the broader laws around slavery made it even harder. Edmund Harrington had already left the state, and attempts to track him down in Louisiana went nowhere. The legal permission he had been granted to run a medical facility on his plantation gave him some cover, because people could argue his activities fell within the broad rights plantation owners had over their enslaved population. Dr. Marcus Webb lost his membership in Philadelphia's medical societies because of his connection to the Greystone Manor experiments, but criminal charges were impossible because of jurisdiction problems and the legal status of the victims. The medical establishment's response was limited to professional punishment, which reflected how badly the whole system failed to protect enslaved people from medical abuse. What happened to M. Washington after all of this remained unknown. Despite huge efforts by Morrison and others, no one ever found any trace of where she went. Some evidence pointed to her possibly having gone north to Canada, like thousands of other escaped enslaved people who wanted to be beyond the reach of American fugitive slave laws. Other accounts had her in Philadelphia working with abolitionist groups to document similar cases of abuse. James Crawford, whose testimony had backed up M. Washington's account, vanished shortly after his letter was published in the Charleston Mercury. His landlord in Charleston said Crawford had suddenly left his room, taking only the basics and leaving no forwarding address. Whether he left on his own or was driven away by threats from people who wanted to shut down the investigation was never determined. The physical evidence from Greystone Manor was kept by the Charleston Medical Society, which recognized how historically important it was even though the circumstances were horrifying. The journals and anatomical drawings gave a rare look into the methods used by people who exploited enslaved individuals for experimental purposes. Historians studying the overlap of medicine, slavery, and systematic abuse in the pre-Civil War South would later rely on this documentation. The Greystone Manor case also revealed that a wider network of people were doing similar things all over the South. Papers found among Harrington's things referenced other plantation owners and doctors conducting what they called research into human nature using enslaved subjects. These networks operated pretty freely, protected by slavery's legal framework and the geographic isolation of plantation communities. the investigation's impact stretched beyond the immediate public outrage to contribute to broader conversations about medical ethics and human experimentation. The carefully documented abuse at Greystone Manor was concrete proof of how medical knowledge could be twisted into a tool of torture and control. That evidence played a part in the gradual development of standards for medical research that would eventually require patient consent and ethical oversight for the enslaved community throughout South Carolina. The revelations about Greystone Manor confirmed just how vulnerable people were when they had no legal protection at all. The case became part of the oral history passed down within enslaved communities, serving as a warning about the dangers of being separated from community support networks. The broader historical importance of the Greystone Manor case lies in how it documented the extreme places that systematic dehumanization could go within the slavery system. The combination of legal authority, medical knowledge, and racial ideology created conditions where Edmund Harrington and his associates could pursue their experimental interests without any real constraint. The case showed how the fundamental denial of human rights built into slavery could enable forms of abuse that went far beyond simple economic exploitation. Research done many decades later would show that the Greystone Manor case wasn't unique. Similar instances of medical experimentation on enslaved individuals happened all over the pre-Civil War South, though few were as thoroughly documented as what Edmund Harrington did. The legal framework that allowed this kind of experimentation lasted well beyond the end of slavery, contributing to ongoing patterns of medical abuse against vulnerable populations. The story of Greystone Manor also shows how important it was that enslaved people shared their testimony to expose systematic abuse. M. Washington's bravery in writing down what she experienced, despite enormous risk to herself, gave Morrison the foundation he needed to uncover crimes that would otherwise have stayed buried. Her letter is one of the only surviving first-person accounts of medical experimentation, as seen through the eyes of its victims. The investigation William Morrison launched illustrated both what journalism could do in exposing systematic abuse and the limits imposed by a legal and social system that protected the people doing the abusing. Despite how thorough his documentation was and how compelling his evidence was, the legal system's response stayed boxed in by its basic acceptance that enslaved people had no legal protections. The final fate of the Greystone Manor property reflected the broader society's desire to move on from the revelations rather than really grapple with what they meant. The plantation was eventually sold to a buyer from Georgia who tore down the main house and turned the land to different agricultural uses. The graves found during the investigation were quietly reburied in an unmarked section of a local church cemetery, and the physical evidence of the experiments was removed from public view. By 1860, the Greystone Manor case had mostly faded from public memory, pushed out by the mounting political crisis building toward the Civil War. The bigger questions raised by the investigation about medical ethics, human experimentation, and the systematic abuse of vulnerable people wouldn't get serious attention until much later in American history. The documents preserved from Greystone Manor stayed in the archives of the Charleston Medical Society until the Civil War damaged the building. Most of the papers were lost, though some fragments survived and eventually ended up at the South Carolina Historical Society. Those remaining documents continue to stand as evidence of one of the most thoroughly documented cases of systematic medical abuse in American history. The legacy of M. Washington's courage in exposing the crimes at Greystone Manor goes beyond just the immediate impact of her testimony. Her willingness to document systematic abuse despite the enormous personal danger established a precedent for survivors of medical experimentation who would later come forward with their own accounts. The letter that started the whole investigation stands as proof of how much power individual testimony has to challenge institutional abuse and demand accountability. The broader historical context of the Greystone Manor case shows how the systematic denial of human rights creates conditions where extreme abuse becomes possible. The legal structure of slavery, combined with the isolation of plantation communities and the emerging field of experimental medicine, gave Edmund Harrington unprecedented opportunities to exploit human subjects for his research. The case demonstrates how quickly medical knowledge can be twisted into a tool of torture when there are no ethical constraints and when the victims have no legal protection. The investigation William Morrison conducted also revealed the limits of contemporary institutions in dealing with systematic abuse. Despite the compelling evidence he put together through his research, the legal and medical establishments proved unable, or just unwilling, to pursue any meaningful accountability for the crimes committed at Greystone Manor. This failure reflected broader patterns of how institutions went along with maintaining systems that allowed systematic abuse of vulnerable populations. The story of Greystone Manor ends without resolution for its victims or meaningful consequences for its perpetrators. Edmund Harrington disappeared into the vast American frontier, taking his medical knowledge and experimental methods with him to new places where similar opportunities for abuse might arise. The individuals who suffered under his experimental protocols were denied justice, their experiences recorded only as cold clinical observations in Harrington's journals. M. Washington's fate remained unknown, though the impact she had in exposing systematic abuse can't be measured only by the immediate response to her testimony. Her detailed documentation of the crimes at Greystone Manor preserved evidence that would otherwise have been completely lost, contributing to historical understanding of the extreme forms medical abuse could take within the slavery system. The courage she showed in coming forward with her account, despite the enormous risks involved, set an example for other survivors of systematic abuse. The cypress swamps around where Greystone Manor once stood continue to hold their secrets, marked only by the occasional foundation stone and the unmarked graves of those who died under Edmund Harrington's experimental protocols. The silence that M. Washington described as characteristic of the plantation's final years has returned, broken only by the natural sounds of wind through Spanish moss and water moving slowly through ancient channels toward the sea. Yet the echoes of what happened at Greystone Manor keep resonating through American history, preserved in the fragments of documentation that survived and in the testimony of those who witnessed systematic abuse and found the courage to speak up. The case stands as a reminder of how quickly medical knowledge can become a tool of oppression when ethical constraints are absent and victims have no legal protection, and of how crucially important it is to listen to those who risk everything to expose institutional abuse. The most disturbing aspect of the Greystone Manor case may not be the specific cruelties that were documented, but rather the systematic, organized nature of the abuse and the ease with which existing legal and social structures enabled it. The case illustrates how the fundamental denial of human rights creates conditions that make extreme abuse not only possible but almost inevitable, and how institutions that should provide protection can instead become complicit in maintaining systems of oppression. Today, the location where Greystone Manor once stood is marked only by a historical society sign that says nothing about Edmund Harrington's experimental activities or the individuals who suffered under his protocols. The official story talks about rice cultivation and antebellum architecture, maintaining the same silence that M. Washington risked her life to break more than 150 years ago. But for those who know the full story, the landscape itself serves as a memorial to the victims whose names were replaced by numbers in Edmund Harrington's journals, whose bodies were subjected to systematic experimentation, and whose experiences were recorded only as clinical observations in service of perverted medical research. Their stories survive in the testimony of M. Washington and the investigation William Morrison conducted, preserved against the forces of historical amnesia that would prefer to forget the extreme forms that systematic dehumanization can take. The true legacy of the Greystone Manor case lies not in the specific crimes that were documented, but in the demonstration of how individual courage can challenge institutional abuse and demand accountability even under the most dangerous circumstances. M. Washington's letter stands as evidence that even within systems designed to deny human dignity and personal agency, individuals can find ways to resist and expose systematic abuse, creating records that preserve truth against attempts to rewrite history. The sound that still echoes from the cypress swamps around Greystone Manor is not the silence that Edmund Harrington sought to maintain, but the voice of M. Washington breaking that silence to demand that the world bear witness to crimes committed in the name of medical knowledge. Her testimony continues to challenge us to recognize and resist the systematic abuse of vulnerable populations, and to make sure that the courage of those who speak out against institutional oppression is not forgotten by history. In the decades that followed the Civil War, occasional reports came out of Louisiana suggesting that Edmund Harrington had set up a new medical practice in remote parishes along the Mississippi River. These accounts were never officially verified, but they described patterns similar to what had happened at Greystone: disappearances and unusual medical activities, this time among the freed black population. Local authorities showed little interest in looking into these reports, which reflected the broader society's reluctance to confront the systematic abuse that had defined the slavery era. Dr. Marcus Webb's fate was equally elusive. Philadelphia medical records showed he left the city shortly after the Greystone Manor investigation was published, apparently heading west to places where medical licensing requirements were less strict. His name popped up occasionally in frontier newspaper accounts describing unusual medical practices, but no formal investigation was ever conducted into what he did after Greystone. The legal precedent set by the Greystone Manor case influenced medical ethics discussions for decades, though real reforms were slow to come. The case was brought up in early efforts to establish standards for medical experimentation, particularly around the need for patient consent and the prohibition of procedures done purely for research purposes. But these discussions stayed largely academic until the 20th century brought renewed attention to medical ethics and human rights. James Crawford's disappearance stayed unexplained until 1892, when a death certificate turned up in New Orleans listing a man by that name who had died in a charity hospital. The certificate noted the deceased had been suffering from what doctors called nervous exhaustion and had repeatedly talked about witnessing events too disturbing to forget. Whether this was the same James Crawford who had worked at Greystone Manor was never conclusively determined. The Charleston Medical Society's archives containing the preserved evidence from Greystone Manor were occasionally accessed by researchers studying the history of medical abuse. These investigations, conducted mainly in the early 20th century, confirmed the systematic nature of Harrington's experiments and identified connections to similar cases throughout the pre-Civil War South. The documentation proved crucial in establishing patterns of medical exploitation that extended far beyond individual plantation settings. M. Washington's ultimate fate remained the investigation's greatest mystery. In 1903, a researcher studying Underground Railroad records claimed to have found evidence that a woman matching her description had reached Canada and lived under a different name until her death in 1898. According to these records, she had continued documenting cases of systematic abuse throughout her life, adding to the growing body of testimony from slavery survivors. The physical location of Greystone Manor went through many changes as successive owners tried to distance the property from its disturbing history. The original foundations were eventually covered by new construction, and the cypress swamp was partially drained for agricultural development. But local residents kept reporting strange sounds and disturbances in the area, leading to persistent stories about the plantation's haunted legacy. Modern archaeological surveys of the former Greystone Manor site, conducted in the 1970s as part of a broader study of plantation archaeology, turned up additional evidence of the systematic abuse that had occurred there. Soil analysis confirmed the presence of chemical compounds matching the preservation methods described in Harrington's journals, while ground-penetrating radar revealed structural oddities suggesting additional burial sites beyond those discovered in the original investigation. The broader historical significance of the Greystone Manor case was finally officially recognized in 1987, when the site was designated a place of historical significance by the South Carolina Historical Commission. The designation acknowledged the importance of preserving evidence of systematic medical abuse while honoring the courage of those who had exposed these crimes. A small memorial was put up bearing only the inscription, "In memory of those who suffered here and in honor of those who spoke for them." Research conducted in the 21st century has placed the Greystone Manor case within the broader context of medical experimentation conducted on enslaved and other vulnerable populations throughout American history. These studies have identified similar patterns of abuse extending well into the 20th century, demonstrating how the dehumanization documented at Greystone Manor set precedents for ongoing systematic exploitation. The testimony of M. Washington stands as one of the most detailed first-person accounts of medical experimentation from the slavery era. Her precise documentation of events, her careful attention to physical details, and her courage in coming forward despite enormous personal risk created a historical record that continues to inform our understanding of systematic abuse and resistance. Her letter represents not only evidence of specific crimes, but also a testament to the power of individual testimony to challenge institutional oppression. The investigation conducted by William Morrison demonstrated both the potential for journalism to expose systematic abuse and the importance of preserving evidence against attempts to suppress or rewrite history. His careful, methodical approach to documenting the crimes at Greystone Manor, combined with his persistence in pushing forward with the investigation despite legal and social obstacles, created a record that survived subsequent attempts to suppress or minimize the significance of the case. The legacy of Greystone Manor extends beyond the specific crimes committed there to encompass bigger questions about medical ethics, human rights, and the responsibility of institutions to protect vulnerable people. The case illustrates how quickly medical knowledge can become a tool of oppression when ethical constraints are absent, and how crucial it is to stay alert to the systematic abuse of power. Today, the former site of Greystone Manor serves as a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge without ethical constraint can lead to the most extreme forms of human exploitation. The silence that once protected Edmund Harrington's experimental protocols has been permanently broken by the testimony of M. Washington and the investigation that her courage made possible. The cypress swamps around Greystone Manor continue to grow, slowly reclaiming the land where systematic abuse once flourished under the protection of legal authority and social indifference. But the voices of those who suffered there and of those who risked everything to expose their suffering remain preserved in the historical record, challenging each generation to recognize and resist the forces that enable systematic dehumanization. The most enduring lesson of the Greystone Manor case may be that individual courage, even under the most dangerous circumstances, can break through institutional silence and demand accountability for systematic abuse. M. Washington's letter stands as proof that truth can survive attempts at suppression and that the testimony of survivors can ultimately challenge even the most powerful systems of oppression. In the end, the story of Greystone Manor is not primarily about the specific horrors that occurred there, but about the human capacity for both extreme cruelty and extraordinary courage. The case reminds us that the protection of human dignity requires constant vigilance against those who would exploit vulnerability for personal gain, and that the voices of those who speak out against systematic abuse must be preserved and honored by history. The sound that echoes from Greystone Manor today is not the silence that Edmund Harrington sought to impose, but the enduring testimony of M. Washington and all those who refuse to let institutional abuse remain hidden in darkness. Their courage continues to light the path toward justice and accountability, ensuring that the lessons learned from systematic abuse are not forgotten by successive generations.